What is up, Preacher Creatures? We are so excited that you're here for another episode of the Preacher Creature podcast. I'm Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary.
And I'm Ashley Lewis. I'm a ministry professional in Durham, North Carolina.
We have a really exciting conversation that we're going to have today with my dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Jerusha Neal. But before we get into that, I think it would be fun just for Ashley, you and I, just to talk a little bit about the significance that this work has had on us and kind of set the stage for the conversation we're about to have.
Yeah, one of the things that's been on my mind is this experience that we have with places where we are, where we spend a lot of time. And I was thinking about how, Jake, you've traveled to some amazing places around the world, a lot of globe trotting. So, what are some of your favorites?
Yeah, so Greece will always have a special place in my heart because I got married when I was 19. I got married in July, and then in September, my spouse and I studied abroad in Thessaloniki, Greece for a semester. And that was
Wow.
both of our first experiences out of the country, and it was a huge culture shock. I learned so much about myself. We learned a lot about one another as a couple. So Greece is always going to be at the top of the list. I'm a big scuba diver, so
Mm.
Hawaii, got to say Hawaii, Bali, amazing places.
Oh,
And then non-beach related places, I would say the fjords of Norway are just
wow.
spectacular. So those would be
That's
my go-to places from what I've experienced. But there's still a lot of world left to see.
mm. That sounds beautiful. And I'm always admiring your pictures and hearing about these stories. I haven't been able to do much traveling in my life. Lately, though, I've been spending a lot of time considering what places have to do with preaching. And the book that we'll discuss today is absolutely part of that. But it's
Yeah.
been coming up in other ways for me, too. Like this process of eco ordination that I'm going
Mm.
through with Seminary of the Wild. Um, this is an online learning community, but a requirement of the program is to build relationships with our particular places. And so we meet online weekly, and we have different ways of engaging with each other and with material and with people. But then when we are offline, we are meant to each be really digging into the places where we are. So we want to
Mm.
go deep into that relationality with our place. And at first, it can get a little bit like this romanticizing of nature and wildness.
Sure.
And, that romanticizing is unfortunately a big part of our Western culture. It's something that we learn in the westernized world. So we, as this eco ordination cohort, we have to confront that anytime we're spending quality time marveling at the natural world. But
Yeah.
then once that realization is confronted and we're aware of it, then the relationship in a deeper sense can really start to take shape.
Mm.
So we visit the same place regularly throughout the year of study, watching it change from season to season. I usually go to a nature preserve near my house called Hollow Rock Park. And we're supposed to be paying attention to, the creatures and beings that we see every
Mm.
time, and then maybe those that make special appearances, and listening for what that place says when it's kind of speaking for itself. Um, so yeah, this has been a really present theme for me. And then in our virtual learning in this program, we have a lot of incredibly wise teachers that come talk to us about some of the more kind of fraught aspects of relationship to place from a westernized perspective.
Yeah.
So we hear about the displacement of Indigenous peoples from Indigenous wisdom keepers. We think about the destructive colonial histories and loss of wisdom over the course of generations, and then what part we might play, even if it's small, in a new story of relationship to place, despite all the damage that's already been done. So it's been really rich to go through this process.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
And here we are in my second year of this formation process. I'm working toward a kind of eco chaplaincy certification, and I'll keep building that relationship to my place. But now I'm also asking this question, which, to be honest, I was also asking all the way through seminary, which is like, how do we preach place?
Mm.
How do we preach place?
Yeah, and that's something that I've struggled with kind of throughout my whole life. I was a military kid, so I've never really felt like I had a place. I called
Mm,
Jacksonville, Florida home because my dad did 3 tours there when he was in the Navy, but it's never really felt like home. And my experience of Jacksonville, like being born there and then moving away and then moving back there and then moving away and then moving back there in high school,
wow.
like when I returned to the place that I remembered, it wasn't the same place.
Mm,
And
yes.
and then you move around for university and grad school and everything. And so Atlanta is the place that I've been in the longest of my entire life. I've been here since 2005,
Mm,
when my wife started her PhD at Georgia State. So this is definitely the place that I've been at the longest.
mm,
And I don't think it was until I moved to Columbia Seminary's campus that I really felt like I was home. Uh, it
mm, yeah.
it's a really special place. We hear owls every night, and there's some friendly coyotes that like to harass my dog a little bit, roaming around the neighborhood. So yeah, that's kind of been my experience with place. And in terms of preaching in place, I mean, I think it's kind of endemic to theological education where we expect people to leave where they're from to study for 3 years in a very different place and then return back to the place that they were
Yeah.
in. But I love that you're getting to do this program with the Seminary of the Wild because you're able to stay in your place, but to benefit from the wisdom of people who are in other places.
Yeah.
When we talk a lot about contextual exegesis and how important it is to understand the various contexts that shape both how you're seeing the text at this particular point in your life, but also how the people whom you're serving are going to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
But it's usually just about the people. It's not about the people being rooted in a particular place.
Mm.
So yeah, there's definitely a lot more work to do on this front, and I'm so indebted to Dr. Neal for helping us to see this.
Absolutely. It's such great work, and we are going to hear much more about this from her. I've been getting to know Dr. Neal in the classroom at Duke Divinity School lately as I'm uh, precepting for her Intro to Preaching class, and we've already started in a more indirect way to start talking about this with the preaching students because, for example, our precepts take place in rooms on the Duke Divinity School campus that are not really the most pleasant rooms to be in. They're kind of on the lowest level. You have to go through these windy hallways with no windows, and it's very fluorescent, like harsh lighting.
Mm.
Our room even has like storage for the chapel stuff in it, and
Oh,
so the students were sort of dimmed on that first day, as we sat in the precept room as they started to think, okay, this is the environment where I'm preaching. And yes, that's one room in one building, but it is part of the story of the campus and this institution, and its story of its place in Durham, right? You can kind of think of how that expands out. And from the very beginning, I was trying to really encourage the students, but also challenge them to think about that space, that room, as part of their sermon.
mm,
Because the place where we preach really does matter, whether we're tuned into it or not. So,
right.
for example, my community farm church, we only really meet outside unless there's a weather event. And so the fact that we're preaching outside means we have to be taking into account the noises, the birds, the rustling of the wind in the trees, and how our voice carries through all of that. Neighbors that are walking by, we're kind of, that's part of the preaching moment. And then I was telling my students, not every congregation that we might preach to and with is excited about where they are. You
That's
know,
true. Yeah.
sometimes we might be visiting with communities that are in places they don't want to be. And I think about like prison ministry for one thing, or immigrant communities, even churches that are out of their sanctuary because of weather or fire or flooding or, decay. And they have to go into their fellowship hall. And it's different when we're down there, right?
It is.
This is something that we must be keeping in mind when we're preaching. And I think that's like one small place where we can start. So I don't know. I'm still exploring this, but and so appreciative of scholars and homileticians and preachers like Dr. Neal, who are helping us think about it in new ways.
Definitely. So maybe it would be helpful for me to share a little bit about Dr. Neal for those who may not be familiar with her or her work. She serves as the Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School. She's written a number of amazing articles, and her latest book is called The Overshadowed Preacher, Mary, the Spirit, and the Labor of Proclamation. And this was published by Erdman's Press, and it arises out of her doctoral dissertation at Princeton Theological Seminary, and it is a brilliant text. It is absolutely brilliant. The way she weaves so many different scholarly voices into the conversation to make a really kind of compelling argument for how we fundamentally understand ourselves as preachers. And I don't want to steal any thunder from her because she might want to talk about that a little bit. But she's also an ordained American Baptist minister. And just a personal note, Jerusha and I began our PhDs at the exact same time. In fact, we met at an interview. We were both interviewing for the same program, and we met at that place. And then she started at Princeton, I started at Emory. So we've kind of been, colleagues going through the Guild of Homiletics for many, many years now. And it's been a delight to get to know her and to continue to learn from her because she's brilliant.
Truly. And it's been a delight for me so far. I can't wait to continue this working relationship that we have. And one of the ways we're going to do that is talking about this amazing book. So it's called Holy Ground, Climate Change, Preaching, and the Apocalypse of Place from Baylor University Press. So without much more waiting, let's bring her in and get this conversation going.
This sounds awesome.
Dr. Neal, it's such a delight to have you with us today. Jake and I are huge fans of you and your work. Your new book, Holy Ground, is masterful, and we just can't wait to share it with our listeners. So thank you so much for being here.
It's an honor to be here with the two of you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So, Jerusha, I always like to start with kind of the 20,000 foot question to get a sense of like why you felt like you needed to write this book and what you're hoping it will do, particularly for preachers, to learn about preaching from your Fijian colleagues in preaching.
Right. Well, I got two answers. The first, very directly, is that this was exhortation that I received from the former president of the Methodist Church in Fiji when we left. As in our sort of goodbye ceremony, he looked at our family and he said, "When you get back to the States, tell your people that climate change is real." And so I think a big part of my work over the last sort of 7 years in sort of conceiving this project and sitting with it was to figure out what part of that story was mine to tell. But it became clear that there was a responsibility that he'd sort of set into my hands in terms of how it was that I had a job to do when I came back. And the question was how to do that well. As to what folks here have to learn, my colleague in Bible, Ellen Davis, and I, we teach a class on hope for creation, ? And one of the assignments in that class is to have students actually preach a climate justice sermon in a local congregation, North Carolina context where they serve. And initially we get all kinds of feedback on why folks are afraid to do that. They'll say, it's an election year. It's a very politicized issue. I have a congregation that is too poor. This is a Whole Foods issue. I have a congregation that's too rich. They're the ones that are the manufacturers in the factory, and they sort of keep the church afloat. They're going to get angry. It'll be an African-American congregation that says we need to talk about racial justice. There's a white congregation that says we need to be talking about racial justice, like all of these things, all of these resistances and reasons not to do it. And what I find is that about 3 or 4 weeks in, preachers start getting honest with us, and they'll say, actually, the reason that I don't preach on this is I have no idea what to say. This is an issue that's so big and is so painful, so unthinkable. I don't know what to say about God. I certainly don't know what to say in 20 minutes about God.
Yeah.
And part of what I think is so significant about these sermons is they ask big questions. They're not afraid of the big questions. These are communities that are actually being relocated now because of rising tides. This is not some, 50 years from now, if the temperature rises such and such degrees.
Right.
Like, this is happening. And they're having to figure out, how do I read these texts? How do I preach on Sunday to this indigenous community that is losing heart connections with land in moving to a new location? And so that's the first thing that I would say to preachers here is, you're right to discern. The questions are big and you're not alone. And one of the things that I think these preachers do for me is they help me see with the new relevance of the biblical text to this work. The biblical text has been leveraged, and everybody knows this, for all kinds of reasons, to sort of mute the climate conversation here, right? Either through false hope, or a kind of God's got it, or it's just irrelevant, right? Like, I mean, there's that piece of it too. Like we don't know what to do with scripture. What's compelling to me about these Fijian preachers is they actually see in scripture all kinds of resources for how to address this issue, because finally what they are perceiving is that fundamentally this is an issue of broken covenant. It is intertwined with colonial history. It is intertwined with broken relationships that go back centuries. And to fix this issue is not finally a technological issue. It is a spiritual, relational issue. And in fact, they wouldn't sort of segment those categories. Right. So there is a way that I think these sermons actually tell preachers here, you have a role in this fight, that preaching matters in ways that I think a lot of times preachers here, we've lost sight of. We're like, what difference does it make to the global crisis we are facing, what I say about an ancient text on a Sunday morning? And these preachers actually are saying, you know what, it matters a lot.
Wow.
Thank you for that. And we're going to stay for a bit with your move in the book, which is to foreground the voices and experiences of these Fijian preachers. And that is something that makes the book so notable. So I think we'd be remiss if we took the conversation in any other direction too quickly. And your stories of working with these preachers that we read about in the book, they're so moving, and pretty quickly as we read, we realize that we're going out with you, as you say, into deep waters. But by bringing us out into these deep waters, we get to understand that we have to go there to try to meet those Fijian preachers where they already are, due to all of these forces outside of their control. And they, as you say, they are already grappling with the spiritual and material losses from climate change. They're facing land loss and relocation and catastrophic weather events right now. And their preaching cannot help but address those losses. And I think really foregrounding what they have to say is one of the most compelling things about this book. So we in the US, we often are more insulated from these effects, not always, but we, because of that insular nature, we can easily lose sight of how quickly these tides are rising on faith communities around the world, and even in our own backyards. And I wonder, as you know, you've spoken with them about their relationship to place, which is such an important theme and claim in the book. as you spent time with them in their sermons, and now that you're back in your place at Duke Divinity School, how did their relationship to place impact their preaching, especially because of climate change? And then how might we, in our Western contexts, preach place more faithfully?
The first thing I would say is they're asking different questions about this crisis than we're asking. And at first, that can seem sort of jarring, right? They're asking questions about who's making the decisions, or they're asking like very particular questions about who belongs to land and who doesn't belong, and how is that negotiated, and right, like this kind of a question. And finally, there are these deep questions about whether restoration is possible, what restoration means if you relocate, what does that mean? And I bring up these three words: sovereignty, belonging, loss. Like these are the questions they're asking again and again and again. And part of what I began to hear in those questions is that actually those questions were very much critiques of colonial models of place that were part of displacements that have gone back centuries. They also still inform a lot of the ways in which research is conducted within the Theological Academy.
Yes.
And by that I mean, I love Courtney Goto's work here, that there's this, there can be a tendency in practical theology to like universalize, like to speak for other people, to sort of want to help in our common home, right? Like that sounds so pretty unless you've actually been colonized by someone else and you want to say, actually, you know what? Not your home, right? Like, you're welcome to come and visit, but right? I mean, like that, right? Like there's some difference there. And I think there's also some issues of control, right? That we bring. We want to fix. We want to help. And what I hear in these questions of sovereignty, belonging, and loss is there is a deep wisdom about what's been broken and what it will take to fix it. And part of what I hear these preachers naming is this holistic connection between the spiritual and the physical. And I mean, this is something, it took me a long time to sort of like really embrace as something more than a metaphor or poetic language or something in Fiji. When they would talk about the relationship between human and non-human creation in a particular place in Fiji, both had agency, both were actors. And to really begin to let that seep in to my understanding took a long time. But it then begins to change, I think, your sense of what it means to be human, how much control you think you have, what your limits are, but also what you're made for, and what your how you thrive, right? Those kind of questions. So I see them also positively begin to talk about place as, what it means to think about place relationally, as place as something that moves and changes, place as something that forms us. We don't just form it. And also place as something that mediates the holy, that actually gives us a revelation and an encounter with God. Like this is very present. So it's a critique. There's also, I think, the beauty there. What I would say is that creates in their sermons a real tensiveness in relation to hope. It is not a hope in quick fixes. It's not a hope in technological solutions. It is this gritty, grounded hope that has to do with that encounter
Mm.
with a God who has chosen not to remain absent from the grief, destruction, catastrophes that non-human creation are facing.
Mm.
And that claim that in the midst of disaster, God comes is fierce.
Mm.
And it is fierce both as critique to insulated places
Yeah.
that have dismissed that presence. And it is also a deep comfort to communities who say, what do we do with
Mhm.
losses so big that no building project is going to make them come back?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
And, naming those things makes it so obvious why you chose the book of Ezekiel as kind of your primary hermeneutical conversation partner and wrestling companion.
Yeah.
So you say in chapter 2, for instance, that Ezekiel might seem like a strange choice for
Yeah.
contemporary conversations around environmental justice, and sure. Um,
Yeah.
but and the book of Ezekiel is sometimes really harsh,
Mhm.
especially surrounding the issues of colonial violence.
Yep.
It sometimes can seem to
Gender.
blame the victims,
Yep.
and the ritual purity things that Ezekiel stresses
Yep.
seem like really out of touch from our contemporary contexts.
Yep.
But it might even seem to suggest a sort of passive approach to ecological devastation. Like we're going to just leave it to God to do the restorative work, and we could just kind of sit back and hope that God will intervene in
You're
this
naming it
miraculous
all, Jake.
way.
Yep. Yep. That's right.
but, but as we journey with you through the rest of the book, we see how the prophet opens up pathways that we
Mm.
in our contemporary Western context might otherwise miss.
Yeah.
And you've now spent a lot of time studying, teaching, and preaching on Ezekiel. And I'm curious, like, what has surprised you most about
Mm.
Ezekiel as a conversation partner for this project, and how might we as preachers start to look at biblical texts differently for
Mm.
preaching on ecological justice?
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things that surprised me were the ways in which his sharpest criticism of Babylonian imperial power, an imperial approach to place that just treats it as an object to be taken
Mhm.
and owned by might, his harshest critiques for that sort, like place that is claimed by might or by blood lineage, or sort of constructed by human ingenuity and power and money, like that thing.
Right.
Those
Yeah.
critiques showed up in the very places in the book that made me most uncomfortable.
Mm.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I had to reckon with was, okay, what part of this is making me uncomfortable? Um, because of the way he is speaking about sexual violence, for example, or the
Mhm.
way
Yeah.
he attributes this to the divine. What about it is that, and what about it is actually connected to a kind of enculturation in, a deep sort of settler colonial mindset that that sort of objectifies land and sees my belonging to land as something that either I can purchase or
Mm.
create, um,
Yeah.
or um, sort of win over with a sort of globalized performance of cultural fluidity. I mean, you name it. Like there's
Mhm.
lots of ways in which we claim belonging in a place. And what if actually place had claims on us?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's hard. That
Yeah.
requires, because it requires us to do our own work, the work of going back in our own histories in North America to say, okay, you know, what actually, what's the restorative work that needs to be done here before any kind of conversation about belonging happens? I mean, to
Yeah.
talk about belonging, at first there needs to be this moment where you say, maybe I don't belong. And what would
Yeah.
need to happen for belonging to be restored? And what if I didn't have control of it? I mean, all of this stuff, right? So the first is the very things that I think folks that bother them about this book, particularly from the ecological perspective, are often the places when he is doing deep work with I call them specters, our ghosts, right, that haunt our work here. I love, so for example, he also treats land as an active agent. I don't like the way he talks about God's punishment of land, but one thing that does is treat land like an active participant in the covenant.
Right.
That land is a player, and therefore, when humans like mute or diminish land's ability to respond in covenantal fidelity to God, like we've got someone we have to answer to in that, right? Okay.
Right.
The other thing that surprises me is his reworking of the conquest narratives. Conquest narratives are they are just so bloodstained, and the ripples of their impact in contemporary history right now are so jagged and difficult.
Yeah.
And in part because of all these purity concerns that he seems to have, like, I hadn't really paid attention to how much he's going back to Exodus and those chapters in Exodus we normally sort of brush over as preachers, all the ones that have to do with the rituals, right?
Right.
And he begins to sort of really do his own, as a displaced person, to rework his own tradition in terms of how it is that it relates to this new reality. How is it that we have holiness when people are displaced from land? How does that work? And one of the things that strikes me, and scholars like Mark Brett or Stephen Cook would sort of back this reading up, is just how radical his proposal is in the 48th chapter, when he claims part of sort of this new land sort of that God is going to bring about as an inheritance for the stranger, for the Garim. And not they're welcome, be good to them, make sure they got enough food, but actually, particularly if they've had children, that land is theirs, inherited.
Yeah.
So there are resources in this book, I think, precisely because it is written from the perspective of someone who has lost so much, having to go back and grapple with parts of the biblical tradition and say, what does this mean in light of what I am now living? The last thing I would say is this, that passivity thing, right? So this is maybe the first place where I heard the resonance between Ezekiel and Fijian preachers. Fijian preachers will often talk a lot about prayer and fasting in relation to the climate crisis. And that, of course, makes me nervous because I've heard language like that in certain spaces in the US kind of used to diminish the crisis. Like, we don't actually need to make any change in how we purchase things or how we manufacture things. We're just going to pray and it'll be good. That's not what's going on in that prayer and fasting in a Fijian context. And when Ezekiel is sort of really grappling with those purity sort of questions, there's also not this avoidance, I don't think, of the material realities of empire that are shaping his life. I think he is trying to find a way to say that the human is not the center of this story. Because finally, that's the imperial lie, that not just the human, but a particular brand of humans, and then perhaps a particular ruler among those humans, that everything exists and rotates around those human needs and desires,
Mm.
and they are the ones that will save, and Ezekiel will not have it. And so what does it mean to both try to chart a way forward of agency for a community at the same time that you are trying to remind the community you are not the center of this story. The
Mm.
story is bigger than you.
Yeah.
So those are some of the moments. I know we just have a certain amount of time, maybe, so I won't talk about the last line in the book, but that I didn't know that Ezekiel was the horse I wanted to ride until the last line in the book. And I had that moment with the last line in the book, and I was like, that's it. This is the book. So I can talk about it
Wow.
now. I can talk about it later.
That moment when you realize that's the one I have to work with, and then you're like, well, we're in it for whatever
We're in it.
comes.
We're in it.
Whatever comes, we gotta, we'll take it.
Oh,
Take it in stride. Yeah. And so the sermons that you include in the book as a resource
yeah.
for preachers do a great job of showing how you put all of this in real context for the preaching moment. And so some of those sermons, I think two of them deal with Ezekiel, and then there are other scriptures as well in those
Well, there's
sermons.
one that kind of deals with the Christological, right? So what do you do with,
Yes.
yeah, like if you have to actually talk about Jesus somewhere, how does that
Right.
happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so we can talk a little bit. I'd love to hear more about the sermons. And in
Yeah.
fact, Jake and I were present for the first sermon in the book that is really situated in Ezekiel. We were present to hear that at Columbia Seminary at the Just Creation Conference. And
It was
it's
such a great
it's in
conference.
it's in my top 3, top 1 sermons I'll never forget, and changed me truly. I think you saw me in that moment, very emotional, Jerusha, and but truly, it is an epic sermon in the best way. And so preachers definitely check those out, and then maybe we could just stay with the implications for preaching and practical theology as a whole,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you've kind of teased that for us a little bit already
Right.
in the book. You're so thoughtful in naming the ways that practical theology as a westernized discipline has perpetuated colonial harm, and especially toward displaced people and creation as a whole. And there's a lot for us to consider and repent here. We sort of can just let the settler colonial mentality run rampant in our lives without even tracing it back to these real events that you've named that have real consequences for displaced people and for us now. So even when we want to do better, we struggle to know how, but you're helping us really chart this new course. So one of the places where you give us a way forward is with your colleague Bale.
Ballet.
Ballet, thank
Ballet.
you.
Yeah.
I should have clarified
No,
first,
you're good.
but
You're good.
ballet was instrumental in helping you identify some particular ways of listening.
Yeah.
And so, will you tell us a bit about what he illuminated for you? Why is listening so crucial for us as a starting place in this work of climate justice preaching? And then, how do the sermons maybe help show that listening at work?
Right. So I was so grateful to have Marika Ballet as a research partner in so much of this work of collecting sermons. Much of the research happened during COVID, which either Fiji was shut down or we were shut down, and in some ways that meant that I was given the gift of dependence on local expertise, and I could not purchase proximity with a plane ticket. Right.
Wow.
That turned out to be one of the great gifts of this project. And we were driving home. There was this part of this project was the very last summer. I had promised everyone who had contributed sermons that I would come to them with what I had written, and they would have veto power, right? but I needed Monica's help in some situations because some better English than others, etc. I wanted just to really make sure I had understood well. So Monica and I had been out visiting a pastor, and we were on our way back, and we began talking about this issue of listening. And he had, this is a research method he has developed. He is a church historian. It will show up in his dissertation, which he is currently writing, the name of that dissertation in the book. Like, go look it up.
Yes.
but is grounded in these sort of four practices of what it means to listen to each other well as a Fijian person. So embodied in actual, like, how you're taught to listen to one another.
Yeah.
You listen to silences. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You listen in mutuality, meaning you aren't just quiet, you risk speech, and then you're quiet again, and then you risk speech, and then you're quiet again. You listen with respect. In other words, you don't try to diminish the story that you hear. You give it validity as you listen. And fourth is that you listen for right response. You listen in order to do something about what you hear. So when I think about the ways in which settler colonialism, let's say, shows up in practical theology, I see it in all of these binaries in our lives together, which really fundamentally come down to not knowing how to deal with difference. David Stark talks about this beautifully in his work.
He does.
Not knowing how to deal with difference. So either we're very hegemonic, or we're very insular and sort of categorizing of otherness. We are, these words, instrumentalizing. We'll take something from one place and plop it down in someplace else, like it's sort of decontextualized as an instrument, or we essentialize. This can only work in this place and this time because it is, this pristine thing that can never change, right? All of this stuff. And it comes out of this lack of musculature as a discipline in walking in humble, accountable, affectable relation, where I show up and I risk showing you my difference, but then I allow my difference to be impacted by yours. And we actually do that together. That sounds like it should be very simple. I think as a discipline, we have a really hard time with it.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why I put those sermons at the end is that these Fijian preachers risked their, sermons are precious things and they're fragile things. They risked their words to their communities because they really wanted their proclamation about climate to affect those that heard it. And I wanted them to see, I wanted to testify that their words had changed the way I practiced and I read scripture and the ways in which that's personally, that was the personal reason. It was that last one, listen for right response. I want Manakambale to know I'm listening and I'm changing what I'm doing because of what I'm hearing. There's another, though, just really practical reason why I put it in there. That my whole story about the last line of Ezekiel, that's in one of those sermons in that book. And I know for a fact, I'm married to a working pastor that is coming up with sermons week to week to week to week. And to sit down and do a deep dive into, decolonial preaching and how is this all going to shape and run back and forth and all that, and it's kind of a long book, right? I just thought I would love to put in pastors' hands conversation starters, where in clergy in clergy groups or even in congregations, you could give a Sunday school class a sermon and a scripture. And you could spark conversation from it, and you could get to some of these deep questions without 200 pages of footnotes, right? For example, you could get to the conversation that needs to be had, and hopefully then people would go back and read the entirety. But I would like these ideas engaged because. I know what it risked some of these preachers to gift them Some of them literally crossed the ocean in motorboats, right? To get to Wi-Fi so that we could,
Yes.
I mean, right. Yeah, they wanted it
It's
heard.
incredible.
They wanted it heard.
Yeah, this is kind of becoming a theme for you, Jerusha. Like your overshadowed preacher book, you're talking about one thing, but you're also talking about all these other things. Like, so the conversations, they're kind of forming these like nodes and networks of theological significance. And I think this book follows right up on the heels of the overshadowed preacher because of these lessons that you're teaching us while you're also teaching us about how we might preach about climate justice.
Yeah.
It's just a real gift that you've given us.
Yeah.
Jake, thank you. Thank you.
So on this podcast, we aim not only to inspire preachers by lifting up exciting resources such as the one that we're talking about today, but we also want preachers to find renewal in community. And in a world with such looming challenges, and as you wrestle with these big questions, how do you find renewal and continued inspiration? That's the first part. And then secondly, how do you help your preaching students to stay connected to the source of living water that will then fuel their preaching ministries?
There's an overlap between those two questions. I think the first thing I'll say quite concretely, which has been a surprise of the last 3 years for me, one of the former students in this class that Dr. Davis and I teach was sort of inspired enough by this sort of conversation about connections and holistic approaches to climate that he went to faculty in Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. So natural sciences, social science, like geological science, that stuff. And he pitched having this 3-day retreat once a year between divinity faculty and the climate science folks. And I think when we all first got together, we were a little nervous because, trust has broken down between the theological and scientific communities a lot on this. And but we both had something we cared very much about, which is that the people who were joining us at this retreat were roughly 30 clergy who really wanted to talk about this in their local communities. And that is something that the scientists really wanted and the theologians really wanted both. And part of what's happened over the 3 years, again, in that it is a little bit like learning another language, right? Listening carefully to someone who's coming at this from a different angle. There are all of these unexpected ways where I have seen God at work in places that I might have said hope seemed very thin. And even in the rebuilding of relationships and the modeling of that and watching the impact that's had on the clergy who've come, it's sort of renewed my trust in this word that these Fijian preachers had for us, which is that actually relationality has to be fixed first. You have to go fix what is broken, and that is climate work, and it will bear fruit. You asked a question too about living water, and I guess what I would say, I mean, really the heart of this book is that displaced communities, for all of their differences, I mean, there's not just one kind of displaced community, but communities that know what it means to belong to land and have lost it. Okay. They know something about God and grief and hope and scripture that those of us who are just scared to lose the little bit that we think we own have no idea about. There's this story in the book that came from that summer when I went back to see these preachers that had offered their sermons. And I visited a village that was in the process of relocation. And they're actually doing something really great. They're trying to have more community ownership in the relocation process, and particularly being really inclusive about all the voices that they include, including voices of women. I mean, they're really trying to do the work in their own community about how is it that we restore relationships as we relocate.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to talk about that. And instead, on the morning that I met with the women in the village, they wanted to tell me about their grief. They weren't ready yet to talk to me about how they were, troubleshooting or gender equity in the process. They wanted to tell me about the night the storm hit, about walking through water that was up to their chins with their babies, like floating in suitcases, like they wept. They just wept. And I mean, they would want me to say and witness to their strength as a community. But they also really wanted me to know that relocating does not bring back what is lost. The grief's real.
Right.
And at the end of that time, one of my sort of former students, Asala Noduva, who was there as our spokesperson and our translator on that day, who's also a pastor, he had the wise pastoral insight to say, can we sing a hymn? And he suggested the Fijian version of It Is Well With My Soul.
Wow.
And if you've ever heard a Fijian community hymn, sort of sing a hymn, more people have heard that now after the Olympics. But it's 4-part harmony. Everybody's on point. Everyone knows how to do it. No instrumentation. Sounds like an organ, right?
Right.
And they do this hymn, and there's tears. And like the peace in that space is complicated right afterward, because it's tear stained, like no simple answer. Nobody's saying it's all fixed. But there absolutely was this affirmation, communal affirmation, that we are not alone in this grief, that there is a God who's with us. Now, when I see that kind of hope, when I see that kind of courage in the face of loss, man, that strengthens my backbone. And I say to these young preachers here in this context who are scared because what do I say and who am I going to make upset? And I'm like, oh, there's a bigger story here than you.
Yeah.
And there's a bigger God than you know. The grief will come. It will come. But you're not alone.
Oh, wow. It's just such holy work. And I think that really says perfectly why you would give the book a name like Holy Ground, and really helping us find a place to stand in this work by telling these very precious stories. And I think one thing that occurs to me as I listen to you speak now is that the events, the context of these folks that you've worked with, that you've told their stories, who are facing these climate catastrophes now, who hold this kind of grief. And we are so privileged to now know their stories too. And yet grief of magnitude, of such weight exists in all communities. And holy work, this holy work is really, how do we as spiritual leaders, as pastors, as preachers, help them through it, really help sit with them, help them sit with it, help navigate these tough waters. And so at kind of not to like reduce down or distill or to universalize, but just helping us find a place to stand in reading this book and then knowing where we can kind of start with it in our own communities. I think that's what's occurring to me now. So we're so privileged to have this conversation with you, and thank you for your book. Preachers, go read it, go get it as soon as you can. And again, start with those sermons if that what makes the most sense for you. See what you can do with those, and send us your feedback too. We'd love to hear what you're thinking about as you sit with this book. So, Dr. Neal, thank you for your time. We so appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great having you.
Great to be here. Thank you both.